Many countries are often accused of being petro-states. In this video, we explore 7 economic indicators and calculate a Petro-Dependence Score to determine which countries are the most dependent on oil and gas exports. In order to select the countries for our analysis, we'll use 2 different metrics: the top global oil and gas producers and the countries with the highest oil and gas production per capita. The first metric captures those countries who dominate production, whereas the second metric allows us to capture smaller countries who produce an outsized amount of oil and gas per capita. High values for either of the metrics can lead a country and its leaders down the path of temptation, an ever-narrowing path of over-reliance on the world's most critical commodity, energy. First, we have the top global oil and gas producers. These are the top 22 countries for combined oil and gas production on a million terajoule basis. We will include all of these countries with the exception of Turkmenistan, which has very little economic data available in the World Bank database. Next, in order to not miss any of the smaller countries, we examine the top 10 for oil and gas production per capita. Here, in addition to the countries that we found in the top 22, we have the nations of Bahrain, Trinidad and Tobago, and Brunei. Adding these countries to the previous list, with the exception of Turkmenistan, will give us a group of 24 countries that has the highest potential for petro-dependence. This set of countries spans a range of continents and includes the Gulf Cooperation Council nations, the GCC, as well as 3 countries from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. They also cover a wide range of economic developmental levels, from developing nations all the way up to the most advanced economies. Despite having the largest proven oil reserves in the world, Venezuela is not on the list. Venezuela's oil and gas production is so limited by sanctions and insufficient access to technology that it fails to extract enough of its resources to place it into contention. If we evaluate 2022 oil production compared with the total proven oil reserves of Venezuela, we find that Venezuela extracts 15 times less crude oil relative to its total oil reserve than Saudi Arabia. Iran, another heavily sanctioned country, extracts 3 times less oil relative to its proven oil reserves when compared with Saudi Arabia. The lack of recent economic data for Venezuela complicates a thorough quantitative analysis, so we will ignore Venezuela as well as Turkmenistan for this video. To quantitatively determine the level of petro-dependence, we will use 6 economic indicators: oil and gas production per capita, natural resource rents (NRR) as a percentage of GDP, manufacturing value added (MVA) as a percentage of GDP, fuel exports as a percentage of total exports, the strength of the correlation between the energy price index and GDP, and high-tech exports as a percentage of total manufactured exports. The 7th indicator, tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, is not available for all countries, so we will examine this metric qualitatively. When evaluating combined oil and gas production per capita, we find that the Gulf states dominate the top of the range, along with Norway, Brunei, and Trinidad and Tobago. Such high levels of fossil fuel production can act to discourage economic diversification and domestic investment in sectors other than oil and gas. Canada acts as the dividing line at 0.5 terajoules per person, with this metric rapidly decreasing until we reach China at 0.01 terajoules per person. Russia and the US have similar levels of energy production at 0.3 and 0.2 respectively. Natural resource rents, or NRR, are the economic gains from extracting and selling natural resources like oil and gas. A high NRR value as a percentage of GDP indicates a high economic reliance on resource extraction and is one of the hallmarks of a petrostate. Brunei, most of the Gulf states, and the other Middle Eastern countries of Iran and Iraq have 20 to 40% of their GDP coming from natural resource rents. For Russia, 12.5% of GDP comes from NRR, with Russia acting as the dividing line between the high and low groups. The North American countries, the US, Canada, and Mexico, have low dependence on natural resource extraction, with America being the lowest in this group, despite it being the largest producer of combined oil and gas. Manufacturing value added as a percentage of GDP, MVA, is a measure of manufacturing and industrial output. Value-added processes like the refining of oil, gas, and mineral ores do count towards MVA. As such, a high level of MVA does not necessarily mean that this economic activity is outside of the energy or mining sector. Some big oil and gas countries like the US and Russia do much of their own refining, and this value-added activity will show up in the MVA figures. A country like Iraq, which has limited refining capabilities and generally exports raw crude, will be very low in this metric, which is what we see. Norway, Australia, and Iraq are the worst of the group. Australia, in addition to oil and gas, relies heavily on its natural resource sector, including mineral ores such as iron, bauxite, and uranium, much of which is exported raw, which shows up here in its low MVA figures. Countries that have a strong manufacturing sector and a high level of diversification will typically have more of their GDP coming from MVA. A strong manufacturing sector also provides valuable jobs and stability to the population. We find that China, Malaysia, and Mexico have the highest reliance on MVA, an indicator of less dependence on the export of oil and gas. A more direct indicator of Petro-State status is a high proportion of fuel exports. For Iraq, fuel exports accounted for around 99.8% of their total merchandise exports, with Algeria and Kuwait not being far behind. We also find Norway, Kazakhstan, and Brunei on the high end of the scale. Russia again serves as the dividing line, with around 46% of Russian merchandise exports being fuels. China, Mexico, and Malaysia rely the least on fuel exports. For China, this isn't surprising, as much of their oil and gas production is used to fuel their enormous domestic market. Next, we'll look at the correlation between the World Bank Energy Index and GDP. Countries that are more petro-dependent and lack diversification will see a strong correlation between GDP and the energy index. There was a massive commodity shock in between 2014 and 2020, so these big swings help us to track over-reliance on energy exports. For the top row, Brunei, Norway, and Kuwait, we find a high correlation between the energy index and GDP, an R-squared value of 0.82 to 0.84. GDP is shown in current USD. If inflation-adjusted GDP would have been used, it's likely the correlation would have been even higher. For the bottom row, we find almost no correlation between energy prices and GDP, indicating a low level of petro-dependence. This correlation data is shown here for all countries in the set. Russia and Trinidad and Tobago also have GDPs that are highly correlated to energy prices. China, the US, and Egypt have GDPs that are the least correlated to energy prices. Egypt does not export much of its oil and gas, with the bulk of its energy production being used for domestic use. For the final metric used to calculate the quantitative Petro-Dependence Score, we will evaluate high-tech products as a percentage of manufactured exports. High-tech manufacturing includes aerospace, computers, pharmaceuticals, scientific instruments, and advanced electrical machinery. This metric serves as a proxy for the level of investment in R&D, education, and the presence of complex and advanced manufacturing activities. As such, it'll be inversely related to overdependence on oil and gas. Malaysia has a staggering 55% of its merchandise exports being in the high-tech category. For some odd reason that I couldn't ascertain, Kazakhstan also has a high amount of high-tech exports. If anyone knows what these products are, please let me know in the comments. China, Australia, the US, Norway, and Mexico also do well here. However, for Norway, much of their high-tech exports are related to oil and gas extraction technologies, as well as renewable energy technologies such as hydroelectric, wind, and solar. This excessive focus on the energy sector could be viewed as another bottleneck for Norwegian diversification. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we find the usual suspects, with Trinidad and Tobago having the least amount of high-tech exports at 0.2%. For an additional qualitative layer in the analysis, we'll look at tax revenues as a percentage of GDP. This dataset is incomplete, so it'll not be used when calculating the final score. Very low tax revenues are a strong indicator of a classical petrostate, especially of those in the Gulf region. A low level of tax revenue indicates that economic activity does not readily create a lot of jobs for the tax-paying populace. For state-owned oil and gas companies, oil and gas revenues merely go directly to the state owners. Bahrain, Iraq, and the UAE have the lowest amount of tax revenue relative to GDP. However, the UAE also exploits this low tax regime in a more productive way, by drawing in wealthy foreigners, entrepreneurs, and startups with its low or zero tax environment. Norway, due to its large public sector and high taxation regime, has the highest proportion of GDP coming from taxes, with Australia being not far behind. Finally, we'll calculate our points calibration curve and then back calculate out the scores for each metric. I'll put a summary table on screen briefly if you'd like to pause and take a look at the individual scores. And then, here's the final count for all the countries in the set for the 6-factor Petro-Dependence Score. A higher score is worse, and a lower score is better. Unsurprisingly, Kuwait and Iraq are the most dependent on oil and gas. Algeria, Qatar, and Brunei are also at the top of the charts, at 3rd, 4th, and 5th respectively. The extent of Norway's dependency is quite remarkable, even greater than the Gulf states of Oman, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, some of the places that the mind conjures up when we hear the word Petro-State. Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, and Russia sit in the middle of the pack. China, with its world-dominant manufacturing sector, has the lowest score, the polar opposite of a petrostate. Malaysia, Indonesia, and Mexico also exhibit very low dependency on oil and gas exports, thanks to their strong and growing manufacturing sectors, beneficiaries of the growing trade war between the US and China. Mexico is often accused of being a petrostate, but this analysis would suggest otherwise. Brazil is also commonly referred to as a petrostate, although it scores significantly better than Australia and Canada. Fifth from the bottom, the US, despite being the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, has a very low dependency on oil and gas exports, with much of its energy production going to serve its immense domestic energy demands. To revisit Norway, if we remove the high-tech export metric, we find that Norway's Petro-Dependence Score is even worse, placing it into third place. Out of all the countries on this list, Norway is certainly the most unique. A European Union abstainer, quite a bit socialist, part capitalist, very much a petrostate, very rich and financially well managed. A true unicorn. And with Nord Stream's unceremonial demise, Norway stands to be one of Europe's only beneficiaries from the war in Ukraine. Who needs the luck of the Irish when you can have the luck of the Nordman? If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and please consider giving it a like or subscribing for more economic data analysis. If you have any comments or suggestions for future videos, feel free to write to me in the comments, and have a good day or night.